Hi, friends. Welcome to a new day. Today, I'd like to share with you the meaning and usage of the phrase, in other words. Let's dive in and explore it. The transitional phrase, in other words, is used to rephrase an idea or statement. It helps to restate or clarify something in a simpler or clearer way. Here are a few synonyms or alternatives to this phrase.
Hi everyone, here are a few examples that will help you understand the meaning and usage of the phrase, in other words, in context. He failed to meet the job requirements. In other words, he did not qualify because he was over the age limit. Some of the product development processes are automated. In other words, they do not require human involvement. His sister is a minimalist. In other words, she is happy with simplicity and few possessions.
Next, let's understand the phrase, in other words, with the help of a conversation.
Have you heard that Daniel's going off the grid for a month?
Off the grid? What do you mean?
He's disconnecting from all technology. No phone, no internet, no social media. In other words, he's taking a complete digital detox.
Wow, that's intense. So no Netflix, no emails, nothing.
Exactly. He says he wants to clear his mind and focus on nature and journaling.
In other words, he's trying to escape the chaos of modern life.
Yep. He said it's been hard to concentrate lately. Too many distractions.
I get that. Sometimes I feel like I'm just jumping from one notification to the next.
Same here. In other words, our attention spans are suffering.
Maybe I should try that too, at least for a weekend.
That's a great idea. Start small. In other words, don't try to disappear for a month like Daniel on your first attempt.
Good point. I'll plan a no-phone Sunday and see how it goes.
In this conversation, the phrase, in other words, is used to clarify or rephrase a previous statement in simpler or more relatable terms.
Friends, it's time to listen to a story that clarifies the meaning and usage of the phrase, in other words, in context. Gabriella stood in front of the whiteboard, staring at the complicated chart her manager had just drawn. We need to streamline this entire workflow, Mr. Samuel explained, tapping his marker on a section. Too many steps are redundant and it's slowing down production. Gabriella tilted her head. So, what exactly are you suggesting? In other words, Mr. Samuel said, we need to cut out anything that doesn't add value and find a simpler way to get the same result. Gabriella nodded slowly. Got it. So instead of sending every report through 3 departments, we send it directly to the one that approves it? Exactly, he replied with a smile. In other words, less red tape, faster results. That evening, Gabriella sat at the dinner table with her younger brother Matthew, helping him with his homework. So the teacher says I need to summarize each chapter, but I don't really get what that means, Matthew said, looking frustrated. In other words, Gabriella said gently, you need to explain the chapter in your own words, but shorter, just the main ideas. Oh, Matthew said, the light bulb going off in his head. Why didn't she just say that? Gabriella laughed. Sometimes people use big words to sound smart. In other words, they make things harder than they need to be. Matthew grinned. You're way better at explaining things. Gabriella smiled and returned to her own laptop. As she began revising her team's workflow document, she thought about how helpful it was to say, in other words, a simple way to make complex ideas clearer. In other words, clarity was the key to everything.